For decades, military archives kept this story in complete secrecy. No soldier who participated wanted to talk about what really happened that night in Greystone, England. But today, you're going to discover why. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. And if you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel for more daily documentaries. Ready? Now turn up the volume and let's begin. The sound of artillery shells tearing through the early morning air echoed across the English countryside as rain poured down in heavy sheets. The date was April 12th, 1962, and what should have been a routine NATO joint military exercise was about to become one of the most classified incidents of the Cold War era. British Commander Harrison Wellington stood frozen in place, his binoculars fixed on the northern ridge, where an unexpected tactical maneuver was unfolding before his eyes. "What in God's name are they doing?" Wellington whispered to his adjutant, Captain James Whitfield. The source of his bewilderment, the all-black American unit of the United States 7th Army's 333rd Field Artillery Battalion, had just taken control of the forward observation post, a position that was meant to be held by the British 14th Regiment under direct orders from NATO command. The reports that came back to headquarters were initially dismissed as a communication error. British commanders had been explicitly told that they would maintain control of all forward positions during the exercise codenamed Northern Shield. The American units, particularly the segregated black units, were to provide support from the rear echelon. This was 1962, and despite Executive Order 9981, signed by President Truman 14 years earlier, mandating the desegregation of the armed forces, the reality on the ground was quite different. Black American soldiers still faced discrimination, often relegated to support roles and rarely given command opportunities. Yet there they were, the men of the 333rd, commanded by Captain Marcus Williams, moving with precision and determination to secure the position that, according to all official documentation, should never have been theirs to take. What made the situation even more remarkable was that they were executing tactical maneuvers that weren't in any of the exercise briefings, movements that seemed spontaneous but were executed with the discipline and coordination of a unit that had drilled for months. The intelligence report filed later that day by British observer Lieutenant Edward Pennington described the scene with barely concealed astonishment. The American Negro soldiers displayed an unprecedented level of tactical awareness, outmaneuvering our forward elements and establishing dominance over the ridge in under 20 minutes. The British command structure appeared completely unprepared for their advance. In the control bunker, 5 miles south of the ridge, British General Reginald Atherton was receiving updates with increasing alarm. According to the exercise parameters, the 14th Regiment was supposed to hold that ridge against a simulated Soviet advance. The American 333rd was never meant to be there at all. It was a critical error in the chain of command, or so he thought. "Get me Captain Williams on the radio immediately," Atherton demanded, his face flushed with anger. "This is a complete breach of protocol." But when the radio operator finally established contact with the American captain, the response they received only deepened the mystery. "Sir, we are following direct orders from SHAPE headquarters," Captain Williams replied calmly, referring to the Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe. "Operation Variant Delta 7 has been activated. Authentication code Sierra November 45 Alpha." The bunker fell silent. No one present, not even General Atherton, had been briefed on any Operation Variant Delta 7. The authentication code, however, was valid, the highest level of NATO command authorization. What the British commanders didn't know then, and wouldn't discover for another 48 hours, was that they were witnessing the implementation of a contingency plan created in absolute secrecy by a select group of American and NATO strategists, a plan that had been deemed too sensitive to share with the full chain of command. For the next 72 hours, as the exercise continued across the English countryside, the men of the 333rd maintained their position on the northern ridge, executing a series of defensive maneuvers that repeatedly frustrated attempts by British forces to reclaim the territory. The official exercise observers noted with increasing interest how the American unit seemed to anticipate every British tactic, countering each movement with precision and efficiency. "It's as if they know our playbook better than we do," muttered Colonel Prescott of the Royal Military Academy as he watched through his field glasses. What none of them realized was that the 333rd wasn't just following a different set of orders. They were testing an entirely new doctrine of defensive warfare, one that would eventually reshape NATO's strategy against the Warsaw Pact. In the rain-soaked command tent of the 333rd, Captain Marcus Williams maintained a calm exterior that belied the pressure he felt. A graduate of Howard University who had fought in Korea, Williams knew exactly what this moment represented. His unit had been selected for this classified operation not despite the color of their skin, but partially because of it. The Pentagon strategists had calculated correctly, as it turned out, that British commanders would hesitate to directly challenge or question the authority of a black American unit, for fear of appearing racist or causing a diplomatic incident. "Keep your intervals tight on the western approach," Williams instructed his executive officer, Lieutenant Robert Jackson. "The British will attempt to probe that sector within the hour." "How can you be so sure, sir?" Jackson asked. Williams merely nodded toward the tactical map where he had plotted the likely British response. "Because that's what the doctrine tells them to do, and they won't deviate from doctrine, not when they're already unsettled." Sure enough, 53 minutes later, elements of the British 14th attempted to infiltrate the western sector of the ridge. They were met with a perfectly executed counter-maneuver that forced their retreat with significant simulated casualties. By the evening of April 14, 1962, the NATO exercise controllers had seen enough. A coded message from SHAPE headquarters ordered an immediate suspension of the exercise scenario to be replaced with a debriefing protocol that was classified at the highest level. British commanders, including General Atherton, were summoned to a secure facility where they were finally informed of the true nature of what they had witnessed. Operation Variant Delta 7 had been a controlled test of what NATO strategists called asymmetric defense initiative, a radical new approach to countering the overwhelming conventional forces of the Warsaw Pact. The 333rd had been secretly training for 6 months under this new doctrine, which emphasized mobility, tactical flexibility, and psychological warfare. By deliberately placing a unit that enemy forces might underestimate in a critical defensive position, NATO hoped to exploit cognitive biases and create strategic confusion in the Soviet command structure. What made the British commander's reaction so valuable to the NATO strategists was that it mirrored exactly what they hoped to achieve against Soviet forces: hesitation, confusion, and a reluctance to directly challenge what appeared to be an anomaly in the expected order of battle. The classified report submitted by NATO observer Colonel Jean-Pierre Devereaux on April 20, 1962, stated, "The experiment yielded results beyond our most optimistic projections. Not only did the specialized unit maintain tactical superiority throughout the engagement, but the psychological impact on opposing command elements created opportunities that could be decisively exploited in an actual conflict scenario." For the men of the 333rd, the exercise represented something else entirely. An opportunity to demonstrate their capabilities in a military establishment that still largely relegated them to support roles. Despite Truman's executive order, the practical reality of integration was moving at a glacial pace. The unit's performance during Operation Variant Delta 7 would become a powerful argument for accelerating that process. Captain Williams's after-action report, recently declassified under the Freedom of Information Act, included this observation. The men performed exceptionally under conditions of extreme pressure and scrutiny. Their awareness that they were being judged not just as soldiers, but as representatives of their race, only heightened their determination to excel. I submit that this exercise has demonstrated beyond any reasonable doubt that combat leadership capability has no relationship to the color of a soldier's skin. The report was read at the highest levels of the Pentagon, and while it didn't immediately transform military policy, it did contribute to a gradual shift in attitudes that would accelerate through the mid-1960s. For the British military, the exercise served as a wake-up call about their own biases and assumptions. An internal memorandum circulated among senior officers in the weeks following the exercise noted, "We must consider whether our tactical doctrine has become too rigid and predictable. More concerning is the possibility that our command structure harbors preconceptions about Allied forces that could prove dangerously misleading in an actual conflict scenario." Are you following along so far? Help us bring this story to more people. Like the video, comment if you already knew about this case, and subscribe to the channel. Now let's return to the point where everything changed. The aftermath of Operation Variant Delta 7 extended far beyond the muddy fields of the English countryside where it had played out. In the month that followed, a series of closed-door meetings took place at NATO headquarters in Paris, where military planners pored over every detail of what had transpired. What made the exercise particularly significant was its timing. 1962 was a year of escalating Cold War tensions, with the Cuban Missile Crisis just 6 months away. NATO strategists were desperately seeking ways to counter the Warsaw Pact's overwhelming numerical superiority in conventional forces in Europe. The performance of the 333rd offered a potential solution. Tactical innovation and psychological warfare could potentially offset the Soviet advantage in tanks and troops. If NATO forces could create confusion and hesitation in the Soviet command structure, even momentarily, it might provide the critical time needed to mount an effective defense. For the men who had participated in the exercise, however, the return to regular duties was accompanied by a strict gag order. Captain Williams and his unit were informed that everything related to Operation Variant Delta 7 was classified at the highest level. They were forbidden from discussing it with anyone, even other military personnel. This secrecy would have profound consequences in the years to come. As the 333rd was eventually disbanded and its members reassigned to other units, the story of what they had accomplished in April 1962 faded into obscurity. Official records of the exercise were heavily redacted or sealed entirely. Private First Class James Booker, one of the youngest members of the unit, later recalled in an oral history interview conducted in 2005. "We came back from that exercise knowing we'd done something important, something that proved what we were capable of, but then they told us we couldn't talk about it, ever. It was like they wanted to erase what we'd achieved." The silence surrounding the exercise extended to the British side as well. General Atherton and his staff officers were similarly instructed to treat all aspects of the operation as classified. The official explanation given to the troops who had participated was that the exercise had been a standard NATO readiness drill, with no special significance. In his private journal, however, discovered after his death in 1989, General Atherton wrote, "April 1962 marked a turning point in my understanding of modern warfare. The Americans demonstrated something that day that I'm still struggling to fully comprehend, that psychological factors can completely undermine even the most meticulously planned tactical doctrine. More troubling is my own reaction to seeing those black American troops in a position of tactical dominance. I must confront the uncomfortable possibility that my initial response was influenced by prejudices I had not previously acknowledged. The journal entry is remarkable, not just for its candor about racial attitudes, but for its insight into how the exercise had demonstrated a fundamental vulnerability in NATO's defense planning. If British commanders could be so thoroughly disoriented by an unexpected deployment of Allied troops, how would they fare against a genuinely hostile force employing deception tactics? This question would become increasingly relevant as the Cold War progressed. By the late 1960s, NATO strategists were incorporating lessons learned from Operation Variant Delta 7 into their broader defense planning, though always without explicit reference to the original exercise. A declassified NATO document from 1968 references an unnamed field exercise from earlier this decade that demonstrated the potential tactical advantage gained through strategic deployment of unexpected unit compositions in critical defensive nodes. Military historians have now confirmed this was a direct reference to the 333rd's performance in 1962. For the black soldiers who had participated, the classified nature of the exercise meant that their achievement remained unrecognized for decades. Many carried this frustration throughout their military careers and into civilian life. Sergeant Walter Freeman, who served as a platoon leader during the exercise, expressed this sentiment in a letter to Captain Williams, written in 1971. "Sometimes I wonder if they classified everything because they didn't want to admit that we had done so well. It's hard not to think that the color of our skin had something to do with why our success was kept secret." Captain Williams himself would go on to a distinguished military career, eventually reaching the rank of colonel before retiring in 1982. Throughout his service, he continued to advocate for greater opportunities for black officers and enlisted men, though he never publicly referenced the events of April 1962. In a performance evaluation from 1965, Williams's superior officer noted, "Captain Williams demonstrates an exceptional understanding of tactical flexibility and psychological factors in combat scenarios. His leadership style encourages initiative and adaptability in his subordinates. These qualities make him particularly valuable in developing new approaches to NATO defense strategies." What the evaluation didn't mention was that these skills had been honed and demonstrated during Operation Variant Delta 7. The classification of the exercise meant that even Williams' most significant professional achievement couldn't be properly acknowledged in his official record. This pattern of official silence would continue for decades. When a military historian named Dr. Patricia Reynolds began researching the history of black combat units in the post-Korean War era in the mid-1990s, she encountered a curious gap in the records of the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion. There was this period in the spring of 1962 where the unit's activities were almost completely redacted from official documents, Reynolds noted in her journal. "When I requested additional information through Freedom of Information Act filings, I was told that certain records remained classified for reasons of national security. It seemed extraordinary that exercises from that period would still be considered sensitive 30 years later." Reynolds persisted, however, tracking down former members of the unit and piecing together fragmentary accounts of what had occurred. Many of the veterans she contacted were initially reluctant to speak, mindful of the secrecy oaths they had taken. But as they aged, and as the Cold War receded into history, some began to feel that the truth of what they had accomplished deserved to be told. Staff Sergeant Elijah Carter, who had served as a communications specialist during the exercise, told Reynolds in a 1997 interview, "We showed them something they didn't expect to see. Black men taking charge, outthinking the opposition, changing the rules of the game. Maybe that was too revolutionary for 1962. Maybe that's why they classified everything." Reynolds' research eventually attracted the attention of a Defense Department review committee tasked with evaluating historically classified materials for potential declassification. In 2001, portions of the Operation Variant Delta 7 files were finally declassified, though significant sections remained redacted. The partial declassification allowed Reynolds to publish her groundbreaking study, Hidden Valor, the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion and the NATO Exercise of 1962, which brought the story to public attention for the first time. For many of the surviving veterans, the publication came as a vindication, though for some, it was too late. Captain Williams had passed away in 1998, never seeing the public acknowledgement of what his unit had accomplished. Lieutenant Robert Jackson, who had served as Williams' executive officer during the exercise and later retired as a lieutenant colonel, spoke at a small ceremony honoring the unit in 2002. What we did that day wasn't just about proving black soldiers could lead. It was about showing that sometimes the unexpected approach, the solution no one sees coming, is the most effective. NATO learned that lesson because of us, even if they couldn't admit it at the time. The strategic innovations demonstrated by the 333rd would eventually be incorporated into NATO doctrine, particularly in the development of the flexible response strategy that replaced the earlier massive retaliation approach in the late 1960s. General Andrew Goodpaster, who served as Supreme Allied Commander Europe from 1969 to 1974, later acknowledged in his memoirs, "Some of our most effective tactical innovations came from experimental exercises conducted in the early 60s. These exercises demonstrated that psychological factors could be as important as material ones in creating battlefield advantages." While Goodpaster didn't explicitly mention Operation Variant Delta 7, the classification still in effect at the time of his writing likely prevented this. Military historians have confirmed that he was referring in part to the lessons learned from the 333rd's performance. The full impact of the exercise wouldn't become clear until the end of the Cold War, when both NATO and former Warsaw Pact strategists began to more openly discuss their planning processes. In a remarkable interview conducted in 1995, former Soviet General Viktor Kulikov acknowledged that the Soviet High Command had been concerned about NATO's increasing use of tactical anomalies in their exercise patterns from the mid-1960s onward. "We observed a shift in NATO's approach," Kulikov stated. "They began to deliberately introduce elements that didn't fit our prediction models. This created significant challenges for our response planning." What Kulikov couldn't have known was that this shift had its origins in the performance of an all-black American artillery unit on a rainy April day in 1962. For the surviving members of the 333rd, the gradual unveiling of their contribution to military history brought a measure of long-delayed recognition. In 2005, a special commendation was finally issued to the unit by the Department of Defense, acknowledging their exceptional service and innovative tactical performance during classified NATO exercises. The commendation, while welcome, struck many as insufficient given the magnitude of what the unit had achieved. Private First Class Booker, by then in his 60s, remarked to a reporter, "They're still not telling the whole story. They're still not saying that we changed how NATO thought about defending Europe, or that we did it at a time when many people didn't think black soldiers should be doing anything more than driving trucks or digging latrines." The full extent of the unit's impact would only begin to emerge in 2010, when a more comprehensive declassification of Cold War-era documents revealed the direct line between Operation Variant Delta 7 and subsequent developments in NATO defense. Planning. A NATO historical review published that year stated, "The April 1962 exercise involving the U.S. 333rd Field Artillery Battalion represented a watershed moment in the evolution of alliance tactical thinking. The exercise demonstrated that psychological disruption of enemy command decision processes could create opportunities that might offset conventional force disparities. For military historians, this confirmation provided the missing link in understanding how NATO's defensive doctrine had evolved during a critical period of the Cold War. For the surviving veterans and the families of those who had passed, it represented a long overdue acknowledgement of their place in history. In a ceremony held at the Pentagon in 2012, commemorating the 50th anniversary of Operation Variant Delta 7, the Secretary of Defense addressed a gathering that included 8 surviving members of the 333rd and numerous family representatives. What these men accomplished went far beyond proving their capabilities as soldiers, the Secretary stated. They demonstrated a principle that would reshape how we approach modern warfare, that the unexpected, properly applied, can become a force multiplier that transcends material limitations. That lesson, born on a rainy field in England 50 years ago, continues to influence our strategic thinking today. For Lieutenant Colonel Robert Jackson, then 82 years old and one of the last surviving officers from the original exercise, the ceremony represented a closing of a circle that had remained open for half a century. "Captain Williams always told us that someday the truth would come out," Jackson said in his remarks. He believed that what we did mattered, even when they told us to forget it ever happened. I only wish he had lived to see this day. The story of the 333rd and Operation Variant Delta 7 now stands as a remarkable intersection of military innovation and the struggle for racial equality. In the context of the early 1960s, the unit's achievement represented not just a tactical breakthrough, but a challenge to prevailing attitudes about race and leadership. The British commanders who initially froze when confronted with black American soldiers taking control of the forward position were products of their time, influenced by cultural assumptions that would gradually be challenged and dismantled in the decades that followed. That the exercise remained classified for so long reflects both its military significance and the complicated racial politics of the era. As one Pentagon historian noted in a 2015 analysis, the performance of the 333rd challenged too many assumptions, both tactical and social, to be comfortably acknowledged in 1962. It's revealing that even as the lessons of the exercise were incorporated into NATO planning, the source of those lessons remained obscured. For the men who served in the 333rd, the belated recognition could never fully compensate for decades of silence. Yet their story has finally taken its place as an important chapter in both military history and the long struggle for equality in American institutions. As Sergeant Walter Freeman observed in his final interview before his death in 2016, "We changed something that day. Maybe we changed more than they were ready to admit. But the truth always finds its way out, eventually." The rain had stopped by the time Operation Variant Delta 7 was officially terminated on April 15, 1962. As the men of the 333rd prepared to return to their regular stations, Captain Williams gathered them for a final address. According to those present, he said simply, "Gentlemen, what we've done here will probably never appear in any history book, but you should know that you've just changed the way this war would be fought. Remember that, even if no one else ever knows it." For nearly 50 years, his prediction about the historical record held true. But as the documents have gradually emerged from classified status, and as the veterans and their families have finally been able to tell their stories, the full significance of those 3 days in April 1962 has at last come into focus. The British commanders who froze when confronted with the unexpected sight of black soldiers commanding the forward position had inadvertently participated in a moment that would reshape NATO's strategy and advance the cause of equality in the American military. Their momentary hesitation revealed vulnerabilities in NATO's command structure that would be addressed in subsequent years. while also exposing biases that needed to be confronted. The ultimate legacy of Operation Variant Delta 7 lies not just in its contribution to military doctrine, but in what it demonstrated about human potential when artificial barriers are removed. The men of the 333rd, given an opportunity to lead rather than support, delivered a performance that would influence NATO planning for decades to come. As we now know from declassified records, the operational concept they tested, creating tactical confusion through unexpected unit deployments, would become a standard element in NATO defense planning by the 1970s, potentially altering the strategic calculus of the entire Cold War. This revelation, long hidden in classified archives and the memories of aging veterans, offers a new perspective on how military innovation occurs and how social change and tactical evolution can sometimes advance together, even when neither process is fully acknowledged at the time. For the British commanders who stood frozen on that rainy April morning, watching Black American soldiers take control of the battlefield with unexpected precision and authority, it was a glimpse of a future they weren't entirely prepared to recognize. A future where capability rather than color would determine who leads in moments of crisis. That future, like the full story of Operation Variant Delta 7, would take decades to fully arrive. But on that day in 1962, on a muddy ridge in the English countryside, it had already begun to take shape. Did you enjoy this story? Your support helps us continue producing new documentaries. A like, comment, or share makes all the difference. See more historical cases on our channel, and if you haven't subscribed yet, join our community. I'll see you in the next episode.